Pandulph crossed the Channel to the camp of Philip Augustus, and appeared in the presence of the King of France, and in the name of the Pope briefly and peremptorily forbade him from proceeding to further hostilities against John, who had now made his peace with the Church. In a rage, Philip demanded, "Have I at the cost of 60,000 pounds assembled at the summons, at the entreaty of the Pope, one of the noblest armaments which has ever met under a king of France? Is all the chivalry of France in arms around their sovereign to be dismissed like hired menials when there is no more use for their services?" But Philip's rage was vain, and his protests were fruitless. In England there followed the action of the nobles in requiring of John the Great Charter, and the chief in this great transaction was that Stephen Langton whom Innocent III had by such immense effort just now succeeded in installing in the Archbishopric of Canterbury as primate of all England. When the news of the granting of Magna Carta reached Innocent, he exclaimed, "What? Have the barons of England presumed to dethrone a king who has taken the cross and placed himself under the protection of the Apostolic See? Do they transfer to others the patrimony of the Church of Rome? By St. Peter, we cannot leave such a crime unpunished." He immediately issued a bull in which he attributed the action of the barons to the inspiration of the devil, and expressed himself as astonished that they had not brought their grievances before his tribunal, and there sought redress, and continues, "Vassals, they have conspired against their lord, knights against their king. They have assailed his lands, seized his capital city, which has been surrendered to them by treason. Under their violence and under fears which might shake the firmest man, he has entered into a treaty with the barons, a treaty not only base and ignominious, but unlawful and unjust, in flagrant violation and diminution of his rights and honor. Wherefore, as the Lord has said by the mouth of his prophet, I have set thee above the nations and above the kingdoms, to pluck up and to destroy, to build up and to plant. And by the mouth of another prophet, break the leagues of ungodliness and loose the heavy burdens. We can no longer pass over in silence such audacious wickedness, committed in contempt of the Apostolic See, in infringement of the rights of the king, to the disgrace of the kingdom of England, to the great peril of the crusade. We therefore, with the advice of our brethren, all together reprove and condemn this charter, prohibiting the king under pain of anathema from observing it, the barons from exacting its observation. We declare the said charter, with all its obligations and guarantees, absolutely null and void." The bull of excommunication against the barons followed rapidly the abrogation of the charter. It was addressed to Peter, Bishop of Winchester, the Abbot of Reading, and the papal envoy. It expressed the utmost astonishment and wrath that Stephen, Archbishop of Canterbury, and his suffragans had shown such want of respect to the papal mandate and of fidelity to their king, that they had rendered him no aid against the disturbers of the peace, that they had been privy to, if not actively engaged in, the rebellious league. Is it thus that these prelates defend the patrimony of Rome? Thus that they protect those who have taken up the cross? Worse than Saracens, they would drive from his realm a king in whom is the best hope of the deliverance of the Holy Land. All disturbers of the king and of the realm are declared to be in the bonds of excommunication. The primate and his suffragans are solemnly enjoined to publish this excommunication in all the churches of the realm, every Sunday and festival, with the sound of bells, until the barons shall have made their absolute submission to the king. Every prelate who disobeys these orders is suspended from his functions. When this excommunication was presented to Archbishop Langton by Pandulph the legate, he positively refused to publish it. He claimed that it could have been only by false representations that the Pope could be brought to issue it. He therefore demanded a delay till the matter could be fairly set before the Pope. But no delay was allowed. The papal delegates declared the primate suspended from his office and themselves published the excommunication. Archbishop Langton, as a Roman cardinal, attended a great council held by Innocent in November 1215, and there his suspension, which had been declared by the legate in England, was solemnly ratified by Pope and Council, and even when it was subsequently relaxed, it was on the condition that he should not return to England. Stephen Langton remained at Rome, though not in custody, yet no less a prisoner. During all this time of Innocent's contest with Philip of France and John of England, he was also conducting a war in Germany. In 1197 had died the Emperor Henry VI, leaving an infant son, Frederick of Sicily, as his only heir. In 1198 this child's mother died, having in her will chosen Innocent III as the guardian of the child. The Pope accepted the guardianship, as he said, not only in word, but in deed. The nobles of Germany assembled in a diet and elected as King of Germany the Emperor's brother, Philip of Swabia. A minority party elected Otto, the second son of Henry the Lion of Saxony. Philip was under the ban of the Church, and when Otto was elected in opposition, since he owed his election to a few prominent churchmen, he was declared champion of the Church. By both Philip and Otto, appeal was made to Innocent III, and as a consequence, 10 years of strife and civil war in Germany are to be traced, if not to the direct instigation, to the inflexible obstinacy of Pope Innocent III. First of all, Innocent made this appeal the occasion of exalting the papacy. He had entered into a long argumentative analysis of the claims of the child heir of Henry VI, of Philip, and of Otto, all of which he issued as a bull, which opened thus: "It belongs to the Apostolic See to pass judgment on the election of the Emperor, both in the first and last resort. In the first, because by her aid and on her account the empire was transplanted from Constantinople, by her as her sole authority for this transplanting, on her behalf and for her better protection. In the last resort, because the emperor receives the final confirmation of his dignity from the Pope, is consecrated, crowned, invested in the imperial dignity by him. That which must be sought is the lawful, the right, the expedient." He admitted that the child heir had been lawfully recognized, that the princes of the empire had twice given their oath to him, but yet Innocent rejected the child's claims, because he was a child of only 2 years old, and because "Woe unto the realm, saith the Scripture, whose king is a child." He argued that the child Frederick, in riper years, could never justly reproach the See of Rome with having robbed him of his empire, because it was the child's own uncle, Philip, who had deprived him of the crown by accepting the election to the imperial office. Yet neither did Innocent allow the crown to Philip, who, in his argument, he makes responsible for the Pope's denial of the crown to the child Frederick, whose guardian the Pope himself was. Of Philip's election he also admits, "Neither can any objection be raised against the legality of the election of Philip. It rests upon the gravity, the dignity, the number of those who chose him. It may appear vindictive, and therefore unbecoming in us, because his father and his brother have been persecutors of the Church, to visit their sins on him. He is mighty, too, in territory, in wealth, in people. Is it not to swim against the stream, to provoke the enmity of the powerful against the Church? We who, if we favored Philip, might enjoy that peace which it is our duty to ensue? Yet, is it right that we should declare against him? The reasons why Innocent considers it right, against right, to declare against Philip are that he had been excommunicated by Innocent's predecessors, because his fathers, the emperors, had made war with his predecessors, the popes, because Philip himself had claimed lands that the pope also claimed, and if while his power was yet unripe, he so persecuted the Holy Church, what would he do if emperor? It behooves us to oppose him before he has reached his full strength. That the sins of the father are visited upon the sons, we know from Holy Writ. We know from many examples: Saul, Jeroboam, Baasha. A further reason is that Philip had sworn fealty to the child Frederick, and was therefore guilty of perjury in accepting the imperial office himself. It is true that Innocent had declared that oath null and void, yet he claimed that, though the oath was null and void, Philip was not released from the oath except by the special absolution of the Pope. This because the Israelites, when they would be released from their oath concerning Gibeon, first consulted the Lord. So should he first have consulted us, who can alone absolve from oaths. Now, as to Otto. It may seem not just to favor his cause because he was chosen but by a minority. Not becoming, because it may seem that the apostolic chair acts not so much from goodwill toward him as from hatred of the others. Not expedient, because he is less powerful. But as the Lord abases the proud and lifts up the humble, as he raised David to the throne, so it is just, befitting, expedient, that we bestow our favor upon Otto. Long enough have we delayed and labored for unity by our letters and our envoys. It beseems us no longer to appear as if we were waiting the issue of events, as if, like Peter, we were denying the truth which is Christ. We must therefore publicly declare ourselves for Otto, himself devoted to the Church, of a race devoted to the Church, by his mother's side from the royal house of England, by his father from the Duke of Saxony, all, especially his ancestor, the Emperor Lothair, the loyal sons of the Church. Him therefore we proclaim, acknowledge as king. Him then we summon to take on himself the imperial crown. The party of Philip, the largest and most powerful part of the empire, refused to believe that this really came from the Pope. They insisted that it must have been the sole production of the papal legate. They therefore wrote immediately to the Pope thus: "Who has ever heard of such presumption? What proof can be adduced for pretensions of which history, authentic documents, and even fable itself is silent? Where have you read, ye popes? Where have you heard, ye cardinals, that your predecessors or your legates have dared to mingle themselves up with the election of a king of the Romans, either as electors or as judges?" The election of the Pope indeed required the assent of the emperor, till Henry I in his generosity removed that limitation. How dares His Holiness, the Pope, to stretch forth his hand to seize that which belongs not to him? There is no higher council in a contested election for the empire than the princes of the empire. Jesus Christ has separated spiritual from temporal affairs. He who serves God should not mingle in worldly matters. He who aims at worldly power is unworthy of spiritual supremacy. Punish, therefore, Most Holy Father, the Bishop of Palestrina for his presumption. Acknowledge Philip, whom we have chosen, and, as it is your duty, prepare to crown him." Innocent answered, declaring that it was not his intention to interfere with the rights of the electors, but it was his right, his duty, to examine and to prove the fitness of him whom he had solemnly to consecrate and to crown. 2 years already had Germany been war-swept, and for 8 years longer, with only short intervals of truce, Germany was abandoned to all the horrors of civil war. The repeated protestations of Innocent that he was not the cause of these fatal discords betray the fact that he was accused of the guilt, and that he had to wrestle with his own conscience to acquit himself of the charge. It was not a war of decisive battles, but of marauding, desolation, havoc, plunder, wasting of harvests, ravaging open and defenseless countries, war waged by prelate against prelate, by prince against prince. Wild Bohemians and bandit soldiers of every race were roving through every province. Throughout the land there was no law. The high roads were impassable on account of robbers, traffic cut off, except on the great rivers from Cologne down the Rhine. From Ratisbon down the Danube, nothing was spared, nothing sacred, church or cloister. Some monasteries were utterly impoverished, some destroyed. The ferocities of war grew into brutalities. The clergy and sacred persons were the victims and perpetrators. June 22, 1208, Philip was assassinated in satisfaction of the private vengeance of one of the fiercest and most lawless chieftains of those lawless times. This left Otto undisputed emperor. To the Pope's legates in Germany he made oath as follows: I promise to honor and obey Pope Innocent as my predecessors have honored and obeyed his. The elections of bishops shall be free, and the vacant sees shall be filled by such as have been elected by the whole chapter or by a majority. Appeals to Rome shall be made freely and freely pursued. I promise to suppress and abolish the abuse that has obtained of seizing the effects of deceased bishops and the revenues of vacant sees. I promise to extirpate all heresies, to restore to the Roman Church all her possessions, whether granted to her by my predecessors or by others, particularly the March of Ancona, the dukedom of Spoleto, and the territories of the Countess Matilda, and inviolately to maintain all the rights and privileges enjoyed by the Apostolic See in the kingdom of Sicily. In the autumn of the same year, Otto went to Italy to receive the imperial crown. The Pope and his emperor met at Viterbo. They embraced. They wept tears of joy in remembrance of their common trials, in transport of their common triumph. Yet the Pope was suspicious of his emperor, and demanded security that Otto would surrender immediately after his coronation the lands of the Church now occupied by his troops. Otto almost resented the suspicion of his loyalty, and Innocent, in his blind confidence, abandoned his demand. October 24, Otto IV was crowned emperor with great magnificence in St. Peter's by Innocent III. Yet this was no sooner done than they were at swords' points. The lands which Innocent hoped would be restored by Otto to the Church, the mere asking for which Otto had pretended to resent as an unjust suspicion of his loyalty to the Church, these were as far removed from the hopes of the Church as ever before. After all his labor, after all his hazards, after all his sacrifices, after all his perils, even his humiliations, Innocent had raised up to himself a more formidable antagonist, a more bitter foe than even the proudest and most ambitious of the Hohenstaufen. Otto spent nearly 3 years in Italy. The child Frederick was now 17, and the party of Philip in Germany and many of the nobles of Italy invited him to become emperor. Otto, hearing of this, hurried to Germany. March 1212, Frederick came to Rome, where he was welcomed by the Pope, the cardinals, and the Senate, and received from Pope Innocent counsel, sanction, and some pecuniary aid for his enterprise. From Rome, Frederick passed on to Germany, arriving at Constance, which shut its gates against Otto and declared for Frederick. Germany all along the Rhine also declared for him. In December 2, he was chosen emperor at Frankfurt. The Battle of Bouvines, May 27, 1214, so weakened Otto's forces as to destroy all hopes of success against Frederick, with whom Philip Augustus was now allied, and in 1215 he practically retired to the home of his youth, where he died July 25, 1217. But already, May 19, 1217, young Frederick had been regularly crowned at Aix-la-Chapelle with the silver crown of Germany. Innocent III also stirred up a crusade, the fourth, against the Mohammedans, which indeed had unexpected and remarkable consequences. It was a crusade by sea, and was raised and sent forth under the auspices of Innocent and the Doge of Venice. It was a crusade intended for the recovery of the Holy Land from the successors of Saladin. But instead of going to Jerusalem, they attacked Constantinople, which they took by storm April 13, 1204. And though Constantinople was a Christian city, yet it fared only less ill than had Turkish Jerusalem when it fell into the hands of the first Crusaders. Even Innocent III lamented the barbarous proceedings of the Crusaders. He exclaimed, "How shall the Greek Church return to ecclesiastical unity and to respect for the Apostolic See, when they have beheld in the Latins only examples of wickedness and works of darkness, for which they might well abhor them worse than dogs? Those who were believed not to seek their own, but the things of Christ Jesus, steeping those swords which they ought to have wielded against the pagan in Christian blood, spared neither religion, nor age, nor sex. They were practicing fornication, incests, adulteries, in the sight of men, abandoning matrons and virgins dedicated to God to the lewdness of grooms. Nor were they satisfied with seizing the wealth of the emperor, the spoils of the princes and the people. They lifted their hands to the treasuries of the churches. What is more heinous? The very consecrated vessels, tearing the tablets of silver from the very altars, breaking in pieces the sacred things, carrying off crosses and relics. In the great church of St. Sophia, which had been built by Justinian, the silver was stripped from the pulpit, an exquisite and highly prized table of oblation was broken in pieces, the sacred chalices were turned into drinking cups, the gold fringe was ripped off the veil of the sanctuary. Asses and horses were led into the churches to carry off the spoil. A prostitute mounted the patriarch's throne and sang, with indecent gestures, a ribald song. The tombs of the emperors were rifled, and the Byzantines saw at once with amazement and anguish the corpse of Justinian, which even decay and putrefaction had for 6 centuries spared in his tomb, exposed to the violation of a mob. It had been understood among those who instigated these atrocious proceedings that the relics were to be brought into a common stock and equitably divided among the conquerors. But each ecclesiastic seized in secret whatever he could. Fire was also added to these other terrors of Innocent's crusaders. On the night of the assault, more houses were burned than could be found in any 3 of the largest cities in France. Although Innocent could recount the barbarities of his crusaders, he did not hesitate a day to reap all the benefit from his conquest of the Eastern Empire. He immediately took under his protection, as Pope, the new order of things in the capital and the empire of the East. The Bishop of Rome at last appointed the Bishop of Constantinople. The acknowledgment of papal supremacy was complete. Rome and Venice divided between them the ill-gotten gains of their undertaking. Yet, beyond all these things, Innocent III stands preeminent as the great persecutor. The crusading spirit, in its fanaticism and savagery, he turned against the heretics, especially the Albigenses. He was the founder of the Inquisition. His exploits in these things, however, will have to be deferred to another chapter. By the ministry of Innocent III, all Christendom, not only all Europe, but Constantinople, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, even the whole East, had been brought into subjection to the papacy. Every ruler, every power of the recognized world, excepting only the Mohammedan, was subject to the papacy. And this triumph was crowned, this too by Innocent III, with the calling of the Parliament of Christendom, the 12th General Council. The council assembled November 1, 1215, and Innocent's boundless ambition was gratified in opening and presiding over the most august assemblage that Latin Christianity had ever seen. The Frankish occupation of Constantinople gave opportunity for the reunion, nominal at least, of the Eastern and the Western churches, and patriarchs of Constantinople and Jerusalem were there in humble obedience to St. Peter. All that was foremost in church and state had come, in person or by representative. Every monarch had his ambassador there, to see that his interests were suffered no detriment from a body which, acting under the direct inspiration of the Holy Ghost, and under the principle that temporal concerns were wholly subordinate to spiritual, might have little respect for the rights of sovereigns. The most learned theologians and doctors were at hand to give counsel as to points of faith and intricate questions of canon law. The princes of the Church were present in numbers wholly unprecedented. Besides patriarchs, there were 71 primates and metropolitans, 412 bishops, more than 800 abbots and priors, and the countless delegates of these prelates who were unable to attend in person. The claims of the papacy, which had been lifted to such a prodigious height by Innocent III, was at that height maintained by his successors. And through all the years that followed the reign of Innocent III, there was almost constant war between the successive popes and the Emperor Frederick II, until the death of Frederick in 1250. In June 1243, Cardinal Fiesco was elected to the papal throne. He took the name of Innocent IV, June 24, 1243 to December 7, 1254, an omen and a menace that he would tread in the footsteps of Innocent III. While he was only Cardinal Fiesco, he had been a personal friend and even a partisan of Frederick II in his contest with the ever-increasing encroachment of the papacy. When the Cardinal Fiesco was elected pope, Frederick was congratulated that his good friend was now pope. But Frederick understood the papacy better than did those who thus congratulated him, and in his reply he pierced to the heart of the very genius of the papacy. In the cardinal I have lost my best friend. In the pope I shall find my worst enemy. This observation of Frederick's not only expressed a general truth of the whole papacy, but he found it abundantly true in his own experience. In 1245 the new pope excommunicated Frederick. Frederick defied him and appealed to Christendom. Against Frederick's defiance and appeal, Innocent IV set forth anew the claims of the papacy, carrying them yet higher than ever. Hitherto the popes had traced only to Constantine their title to temporal and imperial power, but now by Innocent IV it is carried even to Christ himself. In reply to Frederick II, Innocent IV wrote to Christendom as follows: "When the sick man who has scorned milder remedies is subjected to the knife and the cautery, he complains of the cruelty of the physician. When the evildoer who has despised all warning is at length punished, he arraigns his judge. But the physician only looks to the welfare of the sick man. The judge regards the crime, not the person of the criminal. The emperor doubts and denies that all things and all men are subject to the see of Rome, as if we who are to judge angels are not to give sentence in all earthly things. In the Old Testament, priests dethroned unworthy kings. How much more is the vicar of Christ justified in proceeding against him who, expelled from the church as a heretic, is already the portion of hell? Ignorant persons aver that Constantine first gave temporal power to the see of Rome. It was already bestowed by Christ himself, the true king and priest, as inalienable from its nature and absolutely unconditional. Christ founded not only a pontifical, but a royal sovereignty, and committed to Peter the rule both of an earthly and a heavenly kingdom, as is indicated and visibly proved by the plurality of the keys. The power of the sword is in the church and derived from the church. She gives it to the emperor at his coronation, that he may use it lawfully and in her defense. She has the right to say, "Put up thy sword into its sheath." He strives to awaken the jealousy of other temporal kings, as if the relation of their kingdoms to the Pope were the same as those of the electoral kingdom of Germany and the kingdom of Naples. The latter is a papal fief, the former inseparable from the empire, which the Pope transferred as a fief from the east to the west. To the Pope belongs the coronation of the emperor, who is thereby bound by the consent of ancient and modern times to allegiance and subjection. From the high point thus reached by Innocent IV, it was but a single step to the pinnacle of papal claim as respects temporal power. This step was taken, the pinnacle was reached, the absolute unity of church and state was attained by Boniface VIII, December 24, 1294, to October 11, 1303. As Gregory VII appears the most usurping of mankind till we read the history of Innocent III, so Innocent III is thrown into the shade by the superior audacity of Boniface VIII. In 1300, there was a papal jubilee. Boniface issued a bull granting a full remission of all sins to such as should, in the present year or in any other 100th year, visit the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul in Rome. This brought to Rome an immense crowd of people, at times as many as 200,000 strangers at once. Early in that year also came the ambassadors of an emperor-elect. Boniface declared to them that the election of their master was null, and that he did not recognize him as either king of the Romans or as emperor. Then, on a great day of the Jubilee, Boniface himself appeared in the sight of the multitude, clothed in a cuirass, with a helmet on his head, and a sword in his hand held aloft, and exclaimed, "There is no other Caesar, nor king, nor emperor than I, the sovereign pontiff and successor of the apostles." And when afterward he did recognize as emperor the one who had been elected, he would do so only upon the exaction of the following declaration from the emperor-elect: "I recognize the empire to have been transferred by the Holy See from the Greeks to the Germans in the person of Charlemagne, that the right of choosing the king of the Romans has been delegated by the Pope to certain ecclesiastical or secular princes, and finally, that the sovereigns receive from the chiefs of the church the power of the material sword." 2 years later, 1302, this was followed by a confirming bull, Unum Sanctum, in which Pope Boniface VIII, ex cathedra, declared, "There are two swords, the spiritual and the temporal. Our Lord said not of these two swords, 'It is too much,' but 'It is enough.' Both are in the power of the Church, the one the spiritual, to be used by the Church, the other the material, for the Church. The former that of priests, the latter that of kings and soldiers, to be wielded at the command and by the sufferance of the priest. One sword must be under the other, the temporal under the spiritual. The spiritual instituted the temporal power, and judges whether that power is well exercised. It has been set over the nations and over the kingdoms to root up and pull down. If the temporal power errs, it is judged by the spiritual. To deny this is to assert with the heretical Manichaeans two co-equal principles. We therefore assert, define, and pronounce that it is necessary to salvation to believe that every human being is subject to the Pontiff of Rome. Another bull pronounces all persons of whatever rank obliged to appear when personally cited before the audience or apostolic tribunal at Rome, since such is our pleasure, who by divine permission rule the world. It is perfectly fitting that this height of papal arrogance should have been reached in Boniface VIII, for of all the Roman pontiffs, Boniface has left the darkest name for craft, arrogance, ambition, even for avarice and cruelty. Boniface VIII has not merely handed down, and justly, as the pontiff of the loftiest spiritual pretensions which, in their language at least, might have appalled Hildebrand or Innocent III, but almost all contemporary history as well as poetry, from the sublime verse of Dante to the vulgar but vigorous rhapsodies of Jacopone de Todi, are full of those striking and unforgotten touches of haughtiness and rapacity, which, either by adherence to principles grown unpopular, or by his own arrogance and violence, he had raised in great part of Christendom. Boniface was hardly dead when the epitaph, which no time can erase, from the impression of which the most candid mind strives with difficulty to emancipate itself, was proclaimed to the unprotesting Christian world. He came in like a fox, he ruled like a lion, he died like a dog.